Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very pleased to be here for this webinar. It's always strange not being able to see the people who are here, and I'm sure there'll be some familiar faces and some other non-so-familiar faces. But I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar. And today I'm going to talk about an important topic, which is how to ensure that OR projects get implemented and lead to successful change. And I'm going to illustrate this with many case studies, but while the case studies will mainly be in the public and third sectors, it's still, the learning is still very valid for the private sector too. Please do put some questions in the chat. I'm hoping to sort of stop halfway through and answer some, maybe one or two pressing ones, and then take some more at the end of the talk. And otherwise, let's get started. So I'm going to be talking first of all about, very briefly about, well, what makes a good OR project, and then I'll be sharing some learning points on implementation from my early career in government operational research and in the British Coal OR executive. Then talking a bit about what I've learned from a sort of smallish involvement in community operational research and what I learned there. And then some other deployment issues. You know, while I've always been either working in OR or teaching in OR, I've also been in one or two other fields like health and social care and performance measurement, performance management. And some of the learning there, I feel, also is very useful to OR projects. And then I'll talk then about how we address deployment issues with the Public Sector Scorecard and some learning points from my some case studies that I've worked on there. So first of all, what makes a good OR project? Is it identifying the best solution, good recommendations, writing a good report, or is it an impressive presentation? Well, my view is that it's all those things, but really what we need to do is to assist the client in successful change. You can do all those four things, but your report could quite easily just sit there on a desk somewhere and not actually be implemented. So this is what we want to achieve. And this is really the driving point of this session, is how can we assist the client in achieving successful change. So I was very fortunate in my main two projects in government OR to have some senior colleagues who really thought about the deployment issues and integrated that into the project. So this was one at the Department of Environment, Department of Transport, OR group, and it was an 18-month cost-benefit analysis of snow clearance, ice prevention on motorways, how many snow plows do we need, how much salt should we spread, etc. And it involved a simulation model of snow clearance for different snowfall scenarios, traffic flows, snow clearance policies, so the actual policies like numbers of snow plows, etc. But there's quite a lot more to it, because obviously looking at ice prevention as well, and looking at accidents, delays and costs. And what my colleagues did was they organised a monthly meetings with a steering group, and the steering group included the director of highway maintenance, plus a number of other key stakeholders, some experts from the Transport Road and Research Laboratory, and even an ex-snowplow operator. So what we did, we produced a number of working papers, and then the staff agreed on assumptions as we get along. I didn't really realize this learning point until we got to the final presentation, and where our recommendations were accepted. But I realized that if we hadn't had those regular meetings, we could just got a couple of a scientist questioning our assumptions, and our report would just stay in some filing cabinet somewhere in Whitehall and nothing would have happened. So a learning point there was ensure regular contact, not just with your client, but with a range of relevant stakeholders and experts who might influence the outcome of the project. The second one was the Department of Health OR group. I was working with Professor Ray Jackson and his colleagues, and they'd developed this very impressive, innovative way of looking at clinical trials rather than the statistical randomized clinical trials that were there previously. And basically what the main difference is, rather than the clinician having to toss a coin to decide whether a patient gets one treatment or another, we get the clinician to choose the best treatment from them. And then we, as OR people, analyze, well, how does the outcomes we've observed compare with what would have happened if they'd been using a previous treatment. So we validated an old treatment that had been going for a long time and then compared two alternative treatments. One treatment had a good proportion of people actually remitting, but they didn't actually stay much longer in remission, in other words, being disease-free, than the previous trial. And then a second trial had a higher number of people actually not getting into remission, in other words, dying before that. And then we discovered that actually those who did remit actually stayed disease-free for quite a long time. And so that told the clinicians we needed a combination of those two, one with a high proportion going into remission and one with a long-term remission. And they managed to achieve that. And the feature of this project was there's very close client and staff involvement throughout, not me myself, but several of my colleagues went into the operating theatre, observed what was happening, a lot of research papers jointly written with clinicians. And that was actually very important because the statisticians didn't like this approach, even called a meeting in the Royal Society to question it. And the support from clinicians proved very well there. And then after this project, Ray Jackson, he set up the clinical OR unit, first at Warwick University, but now at University College, and some good feedback there from a former director. So my learning point from that was involving frontline staff. And this work with Ray Jackson, this idea of writing reports jointly with clinicians, really helped me when I moved to British Coal. I had a project, we were trialing a prototype production planning and scheduling model for collieries, and I was asked by the director to try it out in a particular pit in Doncaster for a modelling an 18-month period. It might be hard for people to realise now, but there was a lot of resistance to computers at the time. People thought the planners would be made redundant, etc. And but anyway, I got the data from the planner and wrote my report. But instead of actually, sending it to my client, I sent it to the planner and said, "Well, you give me the data. Would you like to be a joint author on the paper?" And he came back to me and said, "Well, could we actually use it to plan the colliery for 20 years till the end of the colliery," which was actually quite important because there's some parts of the coal area which wasn't saleable unless you blended it with the better coal elsewhere. So if you just took the better coal out, you wouldn't do it. And anyway, that collaboration really was the big breakthrough. And then we developed this coal plan model, which was then used in all the collieries and in the UK and some overseas. So that, was some quite good learning too. Then another project in British Coal was presenting the financial case for industry to convert from oil to coal. This was quite a few years ago, but there were government grants for converting from oil or gas to coal. And similarly, the European Union gave interest-free loans. So everybody was trying to give people incentives to change. We had a model on a microcomputer which showed people the effects of that cash flows, discounted cash flow, etc. But we did get some resistance from the more traditional senior managers in there. Maybe they were a bit worried about computers. And it wasn't until we really got some of the junior staff involved and who really became very enthusiastic. We ran workshops in the region and championed their work that it became very successful. It was used in every marketing region and also in exhibitions. This is an earlier version of me with the Secretary of State for Energy and the British Coal chairman. If I look a little bit ill at ease, this was actually during the strike, and I'd spent the previous evening on the miners' support group, so a little bit embarrassed to be photographed with them. And also there was publicity. I was filmed presenting this to a client on a BBC farming programme. It's to some growers. And the learning point there was close involvement with staff at all levels. Don't forget the younger people in the organisation as well. And also I've added there top management. I probably didn't realise this at the time, but one of the things that British Coal OR Group did was they had regular meetings at senior level. I never went to one, I wasn't senior enough, but with the senior managers' quarterly meetings, the directors, say for marketing, would talk about all the marketing projects with a senior OR person, and that really helped people like me who was never very good actually at talking to the most senior clients. And also it gave a little bit of help to the middle managers who were trying to implement projects, knowing that their bosses knew they were there. So also get involvement with top management. Then soon after I moved to Sheffield Business School, Sheffield Polytechnic, we were successful in our joint bid with Northern College to host the OR Society's new national community OR unit. Jonathan Rhodes, the head of president at the time, was spearheading this, and that I'd only had a small role in that unit, and I just did one project with them, but it gave me the opportunity to learn from several experts in problem structuring and in community OR. I was doing a project assisting a group of women trying to influence the design of the maternity hospital in Sheffield. I used the strategic choice approach developed by John Friend, who died earlier this year. Incidentally, I chose that approach not because I thought it was the best. I thought there were a lot of really good problem structuring approaches, but because I felt most comfortable with it. And with a problem structuring approach, you're in there with the workshop, so it's got to fit your personality and you've got to be comfortable with it. So two learning points from that. Firstly, involving, empowering and listening to service users was important in itself, but also led to more successful deployment. Firstly, you know the sort of things that how the users are going to feel about any proposal, and also because they've been involved, it's going to help deployment too. And then secondly, that problem structuring methods and soft OR were crucial in this process. I was aware of problem structuring methods when I was in British Coal, but I never actually met anybody who used it. And this really, and probably a little bit nervous about it because I hadn't used it before as well. So this really helped me in that, but it made me realize that those were really important. I then I'd written some books for the NHS and another book as well on quality in health social care, and I was involved in the European Foundation for Quality Management Health interest group. I was the only non-medic in the group, and they were using the EFQM excellence model. And my learning point there was that OR projects tended to focus on processes, service improvement, but not give enough attention to things like organizational culture, partnerships, leadership, sustainability, all the things that will be important in actually getting projects implemented. A process by itself looks great, but if you haven't really got trained, motivated staff or supportive managers or the right resources, then it won't work. So we do need to look a bit more fully at those aspects. Then in the late 1990s, about the 2000, I had a project I was working on with evaluating an NHS task force to empower non-clinical staff. And then I thought, well, I'll use, I observed that the balanced scorecard was being very successful in the private sector. And I thought, well, maybe I could use this model and revise it, organize it for the public sector, and then use that in the system. And what it was that attracted me about that was that that link that was introduced in the late 1990s between strategy, service improvement, and performance measurement. And people in OR look at all those three areas, but rarely together. So if you're doing a project trying to improve processes or services for a client, there could be a couple of problems with that. First of all, other people in the organization may not share the same view of what the organization needs to do, or feel they maybe should have been involved a bit more. And secondly, often you've got a really good process. I've seen some very good OR projects not get implemented because there were other things that needed to be done for that process, that improvement to work. You maybe need a different way of working. You need some more partnership working, or staff need to be trained slightly differently. So all these things, other things need to happen as well as that process. And so integrating strategy and service improvement was really important. And similarly, we need to integrate it with performance measurement. You don't want to have your new project judged on poor performance measures that don't reflect the outcomes that people are looking for. So developing the public sector scorecard, my main motivation was to get involved in key problems facing society, like reducing obesity, reducing inequalities. And I didn't just want to do a little bit of evaluation at the end. I wanted to try and get involved in those. And I thought, well, let's apply the learning from community OR to the public sector, involving service users, problem structuring methods, etc., and to provide a flexible framework which can incorporate other OR approaches, whether they're soft or hard OR approaches, into that. And in addition to that, I also thought, well, let's provide an alternative for managers and companies that want to use the balanced scorecard, but one that is focused on the outcomes required in the public sector rather than profit or shareholder value. So that was something else for organizations to use themselves. And it was originally developed in 2001 for this task force. But then in 2004, I wrote an article, 8 Essentials of Performance Measurement. And you can see those first two linking strategy, processes, performance measures, balanced set of measures. Those are the two things from the balanced scorecard that are really there, that are really important. And but when after I'd written, I thought, well, I better just have a look at the public sector scorecard and see, well, did it satisfy these things? And it did do a little bit on most of them, but the focus on outcomes wasn't there, and a few other things. And so I reoriented it to make it really fit in with those 8 essentials. So focusing on outcomes, working across organizational boundaries, that is really important for OR. I mean, there's a lot of OR people using systems approaches, systems thinking, systems dynamic, systems methodology, coming up with great insights. But if you want to get real change, you need to work with the people who are responsible for the different areas as well. That would, if you do work together with them, with your systems thinking, you get much better results. Integrating risk management, what we didn't want with COVID was one risk team looking at how to reduce the risk of COVID, and then other teams thinking about what's best for the organization. We need to work together so that we can meet those different objectives together. A systems approach, obviously fundamental to OR, and then a culture of innovation and learning. just say something a little bit about the culture of innovation and learning, because that's probably the most important of all those aspects, really. And basically a top blame, down blame culture doesn't work. As quote of mine, all performance targets are flawed, some are useful. That's based on a quote from Deming, all models are flawed, some are useful. And Deming, the quality guru, was very much against performance targets. I'm assuming it's on your left, it could be on your right, depends how you look at the screen, but the shows a number of the flawed targets that people can have. I'm sure you're all aware of targets that basically, if you meet the target, you can meet the target, but without the intention behind the target. Some people ask me for this perfect, elusive target for their organization, but basically they don't exist. However, some are useful. The graph on the right shows where the Blair government wanted to reduce the number of people waiting for admission to hospital. So there were nearly 400,000 waiting over 6 months in just soon after they got into power. And they got that down to, I think it was actually something like 200 by 2006. That's 200 compared with 400,000. So although that's only partly due to targets, it was a combination of targets and investment in the service that was successful. If you invest in the service without targets, which is what happened in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland for the first couple of years, their waiting times, which were higher in proportion, they rose until they actually also adopted the target scheme. So all performance targets are flawed. Some are useful. I mentioned the quality guru Deming, but also there are several other gurus talk about 80 to 90% of problems are not to do with your staff. They're due to poor management, probably an underestimate. But what it means is that if your staff don't meet a target, there's an 80% chance it's your fault. So you need a performance management culture which encourages staff to help the organization address any problems. So I might just see now if there's any so there's one question says, do you think there's a way to make performance targets less flawed? And what the answer to that actually will probably come a little bit later, but it will basically, if you focus it on the right things, if you focus them on the outcomes that matter to people, and if you don't have a top-down culture, so that we've got an imperfect target. If I was working for you and had to cheat, well, for instance, when I was as a lecturer, if let's say my course got, you found that not many people passed the course, I got a high referral rate, I would hope my manager wouldn't sack me straight away, but would ask me what the problem was. And it might be, and I might be able to say, well, actually, the reason was that we lowered our maths requirement to join the undergraduate course last year, and I believe that was the case. They might ignore me, but they would listen to me. So you use the performance measures to help you plan, but you don't judge people on it without a proper conversation. Somebody's saying, what strategies in particular would you say have been improved through the use of our methods? Well, I think a lot of the case studies that I've talked about and we'll be talking about soon will hopefully answer that question. But that's certainly been a lot of successes of OR over the years. So if I can now move back, I'm just trying to. So I'd now like to introduce the Public Sector Scorecard. it's basically based on 3 elements: outcomes, processes, and capability. And it's a workshop-based approach involving service users, staff, and other key stakeholders, and see very much coming from that community OR background. It's based on those 8 essentials of performance management with 3 phases. And it's basically an integrated problem structuring and performance management framework for the public and third sectors. It's been used in lots of different countries around the world, like Vietnam, actually more case studies than any at the moment, actually. And so it's been quite successful in terms of lots of people, lots of organizations using it, but it's also can be used more as an OR tool as well. And so the 3 phases, the first one is strategy mapping, clarifying outcomes, and then the outputs. What I tend to do myself is to ask people in the workshop setting to look at outcomes and outputs together. So there's no, people are always a bit worried whether one's an output or an outcome, or we as facilitators can sort that out later. So get them to think, what is it we want to achieve, and the sorts of in-between outputs that we will need to do that. And they all then go in a strategy map. Those are the vital link between strategy and performance measurement. Kaplan and Norton, who developed the balanced scorecard, say it describes how shareholder value is created from intangible assets, which also shows how it is a private sector tool, even though it has been adapted for the public sector. But with the Public Sector Scorecard, which is basically, it's not just a version of the balanced scorecard, it's basically a public sector model which takes a couple of those important aspects that the balanced scorecard has been used. And it shows the relationship between capability, processes, and outcome elements. This is strategy map for the Chile National Health Service. They've been using it for quite a long time. The strategic outcomes there, what matters to the organization: reduce health inequalities, ensure the quality of health interventions. Then you've got the service user ones, the financial ones, and then you've got what they want to deliver: reduce mortality, promote healthy diet, etc. And then some of the capability elements as well in there. And next is to integrate risk management. So with a balanced scorecard, they recommend a separate risk management scorecard, but with a public sector scorecard, it's much easier. Generally, we develop a strategy map, largely ignoring risk, then do a risk management workshop if necessary. And then for the key risks, we view reducing that risk as an outcome that we want to achieve. And that goes alongside all the other outcomes. And so we try and brainstorm again and think, well, are we doing it right? Are we looking at the risks as well as the other things as well? And that gets integrated into the strategy map. Then we do our redesigning processes, and that might involve simulation, it might involve more problem structuring, various other aspects, and then addressing the capability, the more organizational factors, etc. And then finally, the measurement and evaluation, developing performance measures. And basically we develop performance measures for each element of the strategy map. We may then decide, well, some of them aren't really worth too costly to measure, or other things. There's a sort of filtering process because we don't want thousands of measures that aren't useful. And then we need to learn from those measures. And then like any good model, you always go back to the beginning and start clarifying the outcomes again. So this is an example from the Ethnic Minority Employment Task Force. This was quite unusual and innovative at its time. Des Brown, who was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, he found himself responsible for the ethnic minority employment target, but realized, well, he can't do it by himself. You know, there's education, other aspects in there. So he got the ministers from 5 different departments, including his own, to join that task force and drive it. And the first stage was splitting that into sub-outcomes, building employability, connecting people to work and equal opportunities, and then looked at the processes. How are we going to do that? You'll see some very out-of-date names of departments in brackets, because obviously that was quite a long time ago now, but it shows that the building employability was largely the responsibility of education, connecting people to work. There were 4 aspects to that are for 4 different departments can contribute to that. And the equal opportunities, there were 2, reducing racial discrimination and racial prejudice. So that's from 2 different ones. And then the capability, so for the education parts, working with low attaining groups, increasing ethnic minority aspirations, and then a number of ones for connecting people to work, and some research on equal opportunities, and then also joint working between departments and leadership from the task force. The individual departments then did their own sort of mini strategy maps as well for their own responsibilities, but it showed how everything fitted together. And it was actually quite a successful thing over that 5-year period. The gap reduced from 22% to 12% in those 5 years. There could have been other things responsible, but obviously if it went the other way, we will be worried. So my learning point was that working across organizational boundaries really works, and that senior involvement was crucial in that. Another project is Sheffield Let's Change for Life. This is a 3-year, £10 million programme aimed at reducing obesity in children and families. I was running a small knowledge exchange project, government funded, with Sheffield's obesity team when opportunity came to bid for this programme. And so we used some of the learning from the strategy map and some of the systems approaches we are looking at to develop a bid with a systems approach tackling obesity in several ways at once. And we were successful in getting the full 10 million. And then we had workshops with the programme board, staff, families, Sheffield Youth Council, and we used a combination of the Public Sector Scorecard and the theory of planned behaviour, so using behavioural OR in with the Public Sector Scorecard. So this was our sort of systems approach. We had 8 different strands on that. Parents as positive role models, a breastfeeding friendly city, open spaces, work with schools, etc. And also social marketing. They decided to call themselves Sheffield Let's Change for Life. And this was the strategy map that we developed. There were strategy maps for each of those strands as well, but this is the overall one. So reducing obesity in children, 2 evidence-based things: better diet and nutrition, increased physical activity, but we also wanted satisfied stakeholders, and then value for money and sustainability. This was, we had funding for 3 years. We wanted the things that we developed to be able to go beyond those 3 years. And then we had the processes. And so these were the names of the 8 strands. As I say, we had individual strategy maps for those. I worked with each of those teams very early on, so we could help them develop their strategy in those areas. However, there was a problem for us both in strategy and in performance measures. How are we going to actually do this? I mean, even though we had some very senior representation, I was on the programme board, we had directors of, children and families in the city council, director of public health, a lot of senior people, but we couldn't get force people to eat better or be more active. So how would we, what should we do to achieve that? And also, how do we know for our evaluation whether we would be successful? And I was sort of leading the evaluation, but working with a couple of people from our Centre for Sport and Excellent Science who were experts in obesity. So I shared this problem with my team, and they said they often used the theory of planned behaviour, and that allowed us to put in this new layer within the strategy map, which basically comes from the theory of planned behaviour. So what we wanted, so if you want to get people to change their behaviour, they need a greater desire to adopt the healthy lifestyle. They need favourable attitudes of others. If you want to be a bit more active, or maybe not go down to the pub with all your mates 4 days a week, what are your mates going to say about it? That sort of thing. Confidence in the ability to change. Well, can I actually do it? And then overcoming barriers to change. And that layer was actually used both for the strategy and in the evaluation. So, for instance, just taking the overcoming barriers to change, what we did is we allocated up to 30,000 for different health communities with Sheffield to come and decide what they wanted for their particular locality. Obviously, had to go through the programme board to make sure it was relevant, but if it was relevant, it would happen. And secondly, in the evaluation, we were evaluating a workshop given to one of the steel companies in Sheffield, and basically the evaluation of the workshop was very good and very positive. But in our evaluation of the theory of planned behaviour, one of the senior managers told me, well, the problem was they hadn't got enough space for a canteen on site, but there was there was a mobile burger bar that was outside the gates of the factory every lunchtime. So clearly, unless that particular barrier was overcome, however many fantastic workshops you give, you weren't going to make that change. So at least we could change the people there to make sure they have healthy options would be the minimum there. And then we also have the capability aspects, joint working between Sheffield City Council, the NHS and different sectors, community engagement, shared vision for the city, and project management and leadership from the programme board. And these are some of the successes, if you like, or the conclusions from it. Obesity rates became better than those for England, nearby towns and city. Greater progress in schools where we intervened with our interventions, and particularly in those deprived areas. We had more children walking, cycling to school, more people breastfeeding, and progress in all 4 components of the theory of planned behaviour. So the strategy map was used completely for the evaluation. That we had performance measures for each aspect, and also similarly for the evaluation of the different strands. But also the conclusion was the prevalence of obesity was still unacceptably high. Some feedback, visually told the story of Sheffield Let's Change for Life, what we are trying to achieve and how. Very important that the strategy maps were developed early on so people knew how they were going to be evaluated. And the learning point for me was that behavioural OR proved crucial in the success of that, both developing the strategy and also in the evaluation. My final case study here, Sheffield Right First Time, and this is about integrating health and adult social care, multi-million-pound project aiming to reduce visits to hospital. So initially had 3 workshops, 3.5 hours with 20 senior people, including directors of social care, hospitals, public health, etc., but also senior managers and some of the people from the third sector as well. And then there was also, they were a bit reluctant to have users in their group. That was, I think people felt that sometimes they couldn't be honest about the problems in the organization with, if you like, their customers present. So we had a separate client reference group and further workshops over a period of several years as the project development. So these were the main outcomes: reduce the necessary acute bed days, health and well-being, people with long-term conditions, and effective use of resources. And the outcomes, a couple there: hospital admissions, length of stay, and in particular, discharge delays. And I won't go into the detail, but there was obviously a number of client perspective, a financial perspective, sustainability, reduced costs of unscheduled care, etc., and a number of other factors. And this is the final one. And each of these elements had, there was performance measures associated with them, not necessarily quantitative. Some of them were qualitative as well, which can be more useful than the quantitative measures. And one of the real innovations here was something called discharge to assess. As you will be well know, that a lot of hospitals, when the patient is ready to be discharged medically, people often carry out assessments, and then when those assessments are complete, they send people home. And in our workshops, we had everybody present, really. We had the senior directors, but we also had the occupational therapists, people at all different levels, and to try to see how this could work. And what they did is sort of like a reverse assumption: why don't we discharge the patient and then assess them in their own home or wherever they've come from? So the idea was they would go home with some trained assessor who will assess their needs at home and provide support until those needs were met. And you can see, if I'd written an OR report recommending this, it's not going to be really any good, really, because I've not been talking to all the different people. There will always be problems. So what they looked at, this was our idea: how are we going to make it work? And because there were all sorts of people in the room, they actually called that they used something called the big room, a sort of Toyota-based thing, but basically just like some of our problem structuring workshops, to try to see how we could make this work. And we did a bit of a pilot work, and it really reduced the length of stay. There was also a number of other aspects, and there was a whole care system dashboard as well, developed, not by me actually, but my colleagues in the NHS. And this shows how the reducing time when medically fit to discharge. Phase 1 was some of our earlier work, and phase 2 was after the discharge to assess. And you can see we got that really down around the 1 day from being medically fit to being discharged. So some very innovative work there done, and that could only really be done by getting people in right across organisational boundaries and at all levels. And some very good feedback from the chief executive, see what's happening right across the system, etc. And some further good feedback. An important byproduct can be used as an input to systems thinking and systems redesign, also involving users as well, and enabling the construction of a balanced metrics panorama at the system level. You can get dashboards. And so just talking a little bit about the methodology, we need to make sure senior staff either participate in the workshops or give a talk at the beginning emphasising their commitment to the project. I mentioned in British Coal that was important, but it's even more important here. If you're getting people to use their time to be in a workshop, contribute their views, they need to know that senior managers are listening. It's workshop based, a project I have mentioned in my President's Medal talk, Stop Smoking service. We had over 100 service users attending our workshops to get their views. So it's a workshop based, invite people across organisational boundaries. A draft strategy map uses a link between workshops. I was imitating the strategic choice approach, which uses a commitment package at the end of each meeting and then brings that to the beginning of the next. So what I do is between each workshop, have a draft of the strategy map and then show that again, ask people, have I missed anything out, anything wrong, etc. Focusing on outcomes, process capability, can incorporate other problem structuring or OR methods, link strategy development, etc. And it's based on the 8 essentials of performance measurement. And so just to summarize really what we need to try and implement OR much better, when I've got basically two aims. One was to increase the deployment of OR projects, and one is to enable OR to contribute to some of the major problems facing society and to try to deal with, to really help use our expertise to do that. So we need a systems approach, and say working across organizational boundaries is really important for systems approaches. So you've got the people there in the different parts of the system can help you actually implement your proposals, involving staff, service users, other key stakeholders, just like the community OR, and then a combination of soft and hard OR methods, addressing strategy, service improvement, and performance measurement, looking at those together, focusing on outcomes, processes, and capability, and then assessing the behavioural factors, looking at behavioural OR, making sure that that also is included. Behavioural aspects can be really vital. You want to change people's behaviour. A lot of things in the public sector require that. For instance, the ethnic minority, we had to try and increase ethnic minority aspirations. Well, we need to have an idea of how, what we need to do to actually achieve that. Look at behavioural factors to do that. Integrate risk management, as I talk about, we don't want the separate risk teams looking at COVID and other things, business as usual. We need to integrate them together, and we need that culture of innovation, improvement, and learning, and not a top-down blame culture. And finally, use the public sector scorecard to help you in the public sector, but I'm hoping those in the private sector also realize that deployment is really not easy for them either. Systems approach, involve your customers, look at the whole supply chain, look at your suppliers, make sure, I've in the business school talked to some suppliers who had some great innovations, but their customers, their big customers, wouldn't talk to them because they felt they should talk to all suppliers equally, and they couldn't use those innovations. Similarly, if you wherever you are in the supply chain, look right the way through that. And working across organizational boundaries, again, within your own organization, but with your partners, other people that provide similar services to the same sort of customers. Problem structuring, again, all those things are important, and addressing strategy, again, very important. So just a couple of things. There's also a workshop for anybody who wants any further information on overcoming challenges. But I'm just going to look at the Q&A. So somebody's just asked me, which book would you say is most insightful within the systems thinking area of OR? I would say that there's quite a few. In the public sector, though, there's some very good books by John Seddon and his colleagues talking about how we can really get people to think in a more systems way, and perhaps tell a bit more about looking at change, how we can actually change people who are organizations or parts of organizations. And there are lots of positive case studies. I'm not quite so sure, I'm sure some of my colleagues would talk a bit more about those in the private sector, and systems thinking, systems methodology in general. Obviously, Mike Jackson's one of the people I would look at as well. But there's a lot of good things in that. And how do you think the public sector could embrace parts of systems thinking more? That's something that I think all of us who are doing work in the public sector need to look at systems thinking. We need to look, beyond the initial project, look at, try to find out, well, why does our client want to do what he says he wants to do? Let's look behind that. What are the outcomes required? What's he really looking to, or what's she really looking to do that? So look at that, and then think more widely at different ways of doing things. And so I think there's a lot of things required, but for us as OR people, we just need to persuade people that is useful. Some very good work by David Lane in this area in the public sector, but lots of other good case studies there. And so I'd also just want to I've got there's a number of references. They're all available from my website, Public Sector Scorecard .co.uk. I'll also just perhaps just give you an example of how you can sometimes just do these things in a more simple way as well. Perhaps I won't give that example, but you only, for instance, you can do things just in a workshop for a simple case. Somebody who came to one of my workshops was a commander of the fire service in Merseyside, and his outcome he was looking for was 0 preventable fire deaths, and then looked at the processes required for that and they included talking to people in old people's homes, care homes, and in offices about the benefits of different fire reduction strategies. And realised then, when he looked at capability, realised that, well, people don't join the fire service to go around care homes talking to people. Literally, they have a firefighting culture. And really, that was what needed to be addressed within his organisation. So you don't need to be all that complicated. You can also build on things. So I just got this strategy map here. I just developed it myself based on a talk that David Attenborough gave on survival hour speech. And it's a bit like some of the other OR problem structuring methods. You can add to it. This is making what he thinks pretty explicit, and you can add other things that are in that you think are more important to that and change it. You can see how it can be used for collaboration. I've used a strategy map where it's been developed, but a couple of important people weren't able to be there at the meeting, so we just can take this draft map with them and get some comments on it from them. So quite a flexible thing. It doesn't necessarily have to have a big project for it to be successful. So other than that, I'm just looking again to see if I've got any more questions. No, so as I say, my main message to you is to really try and do all those things. Look at systems thinking, look at evolving your staff, work across organization, all those things. They're not difficult, but they do require a bit of a leap of faith sometimes if you've not done them before. And I wish you all the success in doing that further. Just do a final check to see there's no more questions. Yeah, well, thank you very much, everybody. I've certainly enjoyed speaking. I hope there's some people there it's always difficult to know how many people are there and what they're getting out to get that feedback, more the visual feedback you sometimes get in a talk. But certainly I enjoyed it and wish you a very good rest of the day. Oh, wait, I've got some more questions in the chat. Oh, just thank yous. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.